back in the day in Virginia, there was actually a law requiring that you grow both, and I quote from my notes right here, English and Indian hemp. So before the US actually had a law against cannabis, you were actually legally required to grow cannabis. And they totally knew about its psychoactive effects, because before it was called marijuana, which is the Spanish name for it, the Mexican name for it, it was called Indian hemp. All right. Good afternoon, History Puffs. Welcome back. My Leo is joining us today.
What's going on, everybody?
What goes together better than a good cigar and intelligent conversation?
Well, I would say a fat backwoods such as this.
Hell yeah. Let's light them up.
Yeah, and in this backwood, I have a very classic strain. It's Chemdog, which is the parent strain for many sativas in America.
So Leo is in Colorado right now.
Yeah, so this is completely legal, by the way, what I'm doing right now.
Now,
100% legal.
Stay off the weed.
We are historians on the channel, so we do not advocate. We're not going to advocate for the use of marijuana, or weed, or cannabis, as whatever you want to call it. But we are going to talk about the history, and it has a very interesting history. So
I'm interested to hear about this.
So I actually have a couple of facts that I'm gonna get started the show with, and I think you can chime in because I've actually heard you rant about this a couple of times. Yeah. So cannabis was actually founded at this, or used at the same time that alcohol was. We think about like 10,000 BC, 8,000 BC, and Homo sapiens, like humans, actually have endocannabinoid receptors in our brains. So we actually are adapted to receive like THC, right, in our brains naturally, the same way that we evolved to be able to process alcohol. And that's why humans were able to eat like rotten fruit and get an edge on their other, sapiens, other kinds of sapiens. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alcohol dehydrogenase in that case.
Right. I know you were telling me about that because you said like caffeine. We don't actually have like caffeine receptors in our brain, but it mimics adenosine. But in the case of THC, we literally have cannabinoid receptors in our brain for it. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, the endogenous form of THC is called anandamide. And your body makes this, most notably during the runner's high, but in other situations too. And it does the same thing essentially that THC does, but it's a naturally occurring version of that. So that's why THC works so easily with the human body.
Okay. Is it mainly like during physical things that you activate those cannabinoid receptors?
I don't know as much about this as I wish I did. That's the most notable one, is in like stressful physical situations. It releases the anandamide to like make you feel good, so you relax essentially and not do something stupid that would, get yourself killed essentially.
So you can get couch locked, right?
Well, that's what happens when you have an increase in anandamide when you're sitting on the couch. So, but yeah.
So our story with cannabis actually starts back in China. So it actually grows naturally in like the Hindu Kush. The Kush area. So it's in China, it's in India. Those are the earliest documented cases. And actually, for the longest time, it was used for medicine, but we actually started out using it for rope, clothing, and paper back in the day. So the Chinese actually used to make paper out of it starting out. I know like the Egyptians used papyrus, but they used cannabis. And actually in the Hindu Vedas, like their religious texts, there's a drug referred to called soma. And we think that this is actually cannabis. There's a lot of evidence, like you were saying, like relaxing, but also like psychoactive, makes you, see things sometimes. We think it is actually cannabis because it grows there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I've heard about soma before. I didn't realize it was cannabis, though. I thought it was like some sort of long-lost psychedelic drug that they made.
Well, actually, I think the Amanita muscaria mushroom grows naturally in that area of the world. So that could have been it too. We really don't know. But there is a drug called soma that's referred to in the in the Vedas.
Mhm.
So, and then the way it actually, the Assyrians referred to, we actually get the word cannabis from the Assyrian word kunabu, which
Really?
actually means aromatic, because they used to use it as a fragrance, actually.
That's funny.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but for the longest time, and I know you know about this, hash. Hash was actually the most commonly used form of it for its psychoactive purposes. They knew about smoking, but they actually didn't really smoke it much until tobacco came around. They used to eat it in the
Right, they ate it.
hash form, yeah. And so that was in the Arabian region. And so you know about the hashashin, right? Yeah,
I do. The
Talk about that for a bit.
assassins, so to speak.
Yeah.
Which that name, the word assassin comes from hashashin, which comes from a sort of nickname that they called them, I guess. I mean, maybe it wasn't a nickname, but they called them that because they ate hash before they would go out and do their stuff.
Yeah.
So assassin actually is related to weed, which is kind of funny.
Right. No.
Word assassin.
Yeah. And then our friend Coolio is actually he was telling us that the ancient Sikhs used to use weed or cannabis before battle to actually get them hyped up. You know.
Yeah, a lot of cultures, now that I've looked into this, I mean, not just weed, but weed is a good example. Like they would use various drugs as like a pre-battle thing, almost like a pre-workout in a way.
Pre-workout, yeah.
An ancient pre-workout.
Yeah, using hash as your pre-workout.
That's a little, yeah, that's an insane pre-workout. I will say that. I don't know if I necessarily have a good workout for that, but maybe the hashashins. You know, I mean, if they're literally called hashashins, they probably have it down. They've figured it out.
I know, no. I mean, they got popular for a reason.
All right, so my computer died.
Okay. Yeah. But no, a question I have for you is the first Assassin's Creed. Doesn't that take place in Jerusalem?
Yeah, in the Holy Land. Yep.
The Holy Land. So do you think that's the order of the Hashashin, or that's what it was based off
Yeah,
of?
that's what it's based off, but they didn't have any references to weed in Assassin's Creed the game for obvious reasons. But yeah, that's exactly what it's based on, actually, because the Hashashin were in the Holy Land. I'm not really sure how long, like if they were there before the Crusades, but the first mention of the Hashashin was when the Crusaders encountered them.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the other thing that they were famous with is the Mongols. I know that they were messing with the Mongol invaders when they came through later on.
Okay.
So,
wow, that's really interesting. Because and I'm actually skipping ahead a little bit here. I've got some interesting facts in between, but the reason why cannabis came to European nations is actually Napoleon. So what happened was, yeah, at the time, Islam had a ban on alcohol and also coffee, because in bars and in coffee shops, people would like plot against the sultan who was in charge. So, but there was no ban on cannabis. And so what happened was when Napoleon's troops came to Egypt, they wanted alcohol, but they couldn't get any. So they started using hash, actually. And so they brought it back to France. And then actually French doctors and, practitioners and whatnot actually adopted it at apothecaries for its medical applications. So, but all the way back in, and actually, I don't know if you know about the medical benefits of cannabis, but it was used for a medicine as early as like 5000 BC in China. In fact, they used it for rope and medicine primarily. Yeah, I know the main thing I know about cannabis is for seizures. It's very effective for epilepsy. Glaucoma is another one that's very well documented. Giving people appetites back. So cancer patients, older folks, people who need to eat, but they don't feel like eating. It's a great way to do that. Obviously, it makes any normal person feel like eating too, but it's a medicine in the sense that it helps somebody who needs to eat. So yeah, there's lots of ways it can be medicine. I've also heard about chemo, or like cancer, like recovering from chemotherapy, things like that. I don't know if they knew about how to cure cancer back then, but they might have used it for something like that. They might have noticed somebody who was using cannabis was doing better in terms of their outcome with cancer versus somebody who wasn't. You know what I mean? It would have been like experiential evidence like that. But I mean, if it works, it works. So they would have, notice a consistent pattern perhaps, and then decide, okay, this is probably a good idea. Right. Well, this is back in the day that, in the 19th century, you could go to the corner store and you could buy opium or cocaine, or things like that. So they had all kinds of drugs in these stores, and they actually had practical medical purposes, when used correctly. So And actually, I'm going to get onto the next fact. So it spreads to European nations because of Napoleon, and that was actually studied and used actually as a medicine before anything. But the Americans got it because in Jamestown, right, this is the age of colonialism. So there were lots, ships were a huge commodity back then. You had to make sure you had lots of ships, and ships need rope. And so back in the day in Virginia, there was actually a law requiring that you grow both, and I quote from my notes right here, English and Indian hemp. So before the US actually had a law against cannabis, you were actually legally required to grow cannabis. And they totally knew about its psychoactive effects, because before it was called marijuana, which is the Spanish name for it, the Mexican name for it, it was called Indian hemp. So imagine that, you had to grow cannabis.
They were locking you up because you weren't growing weed. I don't believe in weed. Go to jail.
I know, right? Yeah, isn't that funny? So yeah, it was primarily used for rope and clothing and things like that. And actually, it does originate in the, like China and India, but they actually found Native Americans growing it. So I wonder how it spread around the world.
Well, one thing about weed is that it is a weed.
It's
and
a
it
weed.
grows not almost everywhere, but most places that can grow other plants, especially if weeds can sprout up there, it can spread up. So, it's very easy to grow. It's very useful. Like you said, there's lots of these different things you can do with it. So it would make sense that most cultures would discover it and realize how useful it would be for them. And it would become sort of a worthwhile thing.
All right. So I'll let you take this one. So cannabis illegalization in the US. All right. Do you know how that goes down in the 30s?
All right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Harry Anslinger, is he the one?
Name dropping. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was this newspaper dude, right? He owned a newspaper company, Harry Anslinger.
Yeah.
He was noticing that hemp paper was about to, put his paper mills out of business or something along those lines. And so he wanted to find a way to demonize hemp. And so he noticed that it was sort of associated with Mexican people to smoke weed. And he was like, I'm just going to call it marijuana, which doesn't even mean that, it means wild tobacco in Spanish, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he decided to call it this name, this propaganda name, and then say that this weed is making the Mexicans go crazy and rape white women and so forth.
Right.
And he sort of, because he had a newspaper, he was able to broadcast this to everybody. He would just print stories about it. And then over time, I'm not really sure how it became illegal, but that's basically what started it.
Actually, I can capitalize off that. So Henry Anslinger started the hype behind it, right? And so in the 30s, the FDA was going out of business because alcohol was prohibited in the US. So they needed a new enemy to criminalize so they could stay in business. And so they picked cannabis because at the time, America did not like Mexicans. So very easy to demonize that. And actually, there's a trend. So illegalization across the world follows the same trend of a white European nation gets an influx of foreign non-white immigrants who smoke cannabis, right, or use it, and then they legalize it. So the trend goes, the first one to legalize it was actually Britain. And what happened was there were all these Indians coming from India, right, and they were bringing hash with them. All right. And they didn't like how how they were using hash all the time. So they legalized it. Right. And then the same thing in France. So in France, there were lots of Africans coming to France. Right. And they were bringing with them cannabis. And the Africans actually smoked. They were the ones who invented smoking weed, actually.
Really?
Yeah, the earliest found weed pipes for smoking are actually found in Africa. The Arabians and the Indians actually ate it, but the Africans used to smoke it. So again, these Africans come, they bring their weed. The Europeans don't like it, so they legalize it. And then my next fun fact is Canada. So Canada is the last country to illegalize weed, and then the first country to legalize it. And actually, they hopped on the bandwagon literally because there were no documented uses of cannabis in Canada ever. and they illegalized it in like 1890, I think, or 19 something, right? And then, yeah, no documented uses, they still illegalized it. So then they actually saw the medical benefits of it, and then they legalized it for medicine, and then they legalized it recreationally in 1996. But it's funny, so at first you can use cannabis however you want, and then it's only for medical purposes, and then it's illegalized, and then it's for medical purpose, and then it's recreational. So it's sort of this, reverse chain of events there. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
You see that trend though, like, European nation gets an influx of non-white immigrants who use cannabis, and then they, illegalize it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Figures though, human nature, right?
I think politicians are starting to turn around on that. But yeah, so actually, and you definitely know a lot about this. So cannabis was illegalized, but it was actually loosely legal until the 60s. Because in the 60s, we had the war on drugs happen. I know you know about this, so you can take that away. Who was president at the time?
Nixon was president at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the background, well, actually, yeah, it was the hippies. So
yeah,
he didn't like the cultural movement the hippies were promoting, which was sort of an anti-government peace movement, free love movement, all those things. And it was literally the antagonistic view to the Puritan Judeo-Christian values of like that generation. And so he noticed that the hippies like to do drugs together as part of like one of the things that they would do. And so he's just like, we're going to make these illegal. And he started the war on drugs, and I think it was 1971.
He did,
saying that drugs are public enemy number one.
Yeah.
So murderers, not the rapist. Public enemy number one is drugs.
And actually, to capitalize on that, the hippies opposed the Vietnam War at the time. And there was a hippie, I forget his name, but this hippie was actually a lead scientist studying LSD at the time. And they were making groundbreaking research in psychology. And what he said was, President Nixon, if people do this, I'm sorry, were you saying something?
Was it Timothy Leary?
Timothy Leary, yeah, I think it was. And he said, President Nixon, if people do this, they're not going to fight your wars, and they're not going to follow your laws. And on that, they agreed. So Nixon illegalized them. And his Secretary of State at the time, I'll put this quote on the screen in a bit, they knowingly admitted that there was nothing wrong with the drugs, but they legalized them so they could arrest the leaders of the counterculture movements. So there was that. But anyways, so then you have the war on drugs, which gets very corrupt very quickly because you have people like Ronald Reagan doing the Iran-Contra scandal, where they actually condoned the importing of cocaine into the United States so that they could stimulate the Nicaraguan economy, so they could fund the counter communism movements in that country. So, yeah, a lot of behind the scenes stuff there. So then let's get on to legalization. So, wait, I actually forget which state was the first one to legalize it.
The first state to legalize it was right here in Colorado.
Oh, what? Oh, really? I thought it was California.
Well, so technically, the first state to legalize weed was California in 1995, the year I was born. They legalized weed for medical use.
Okay. Really? 1995?
The thing about medical use, from what I understand, it's basically the same as recreational use. It's just that you have to have a medical card.
Right.
So like when you go to the dispensary, you're still like literally buying flour. It's not even like in a pill form or something. So it's just like, it's basically legal weed for like they knew that they couldn't really demonize it from a scientific standpoint anymore. I think that's kind of why they legalized it. It's like, all right, we'll legalize it, but we're going to put this barrier in the way. So only people who are like hell bent on smoking weed are going to smoke weed, essentially. You know what I mean? Because like anybody could essentially have gotten a medical card if they just would go in and say, oh, like, I'm anxious or I have back pain or whatever the symptoms that you had to list were.
Right.
And if you really wanted it, you could get it. So it was kind of like, we'll just satisfy the crazy weed heads essentially. And see if it rushes over. But the benefits and so forth, and also just the nature of it being a very safe recreational drug, much safer than a lot of the legal options, that's what's really putting it over the edge, I think.
Absolutely. And actually, I have a quote from the British. So this is back in 1860, they started realizing the harmlessness of the drug. And they had this is after the British illegalized cannabis in 1840. There was a British representative of the Indian Committee, and he actually went to evaluate the use of cannabis in India. And he wrote down that only in extremely excessive use does it pose any harm to the individual. And then he says, and I quote, "But it has no harm on the society around him." So as early as 1860, they realized the harmlessness of cannabis. So, and then finally, we're seeing a lot of European countries decriminalize or legalize weed, like Czechoslovakia, Canada, and then I think who else did it? I forget. I don't think it's legal in Germany, but I know Amsterdam it is. Holland.
I didn't know it was decriminalized in the Czech Republic.
It is. I think it's completely legal. So now we're starting to see a global trend of legalization going on. And actually, here's a fun fact. So during the war on drugs, the United States actually had what I call a cannabis genocide. So they actually paid millions of dollars in the 70s for Afghan, Belizean, and a lot of other countries to torch their cannabis fields.
Really?
They wanted to eradicate cannabis from the earth. So they paid millions of government dollars to genocide weed. So
Wow.
that was cool. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, so how's that backwoods treating you?
Oh, dude, destroyed as always. The woods never fail.
Woods never fail. Okay.
Also, when you roll them this fucking big, like, that's what happens.
That thing's about the size of my thumb. Like, look at that.
Yeah. I'm gonna mess up with my backwoods.
Absolutely. So this is just as we're wrapping up. How do you think that the legalization of cannabis is going to change the culture in the U.S.?
I think it'll make people more down to earth about stuff and just like, oh, like you like to smoke weed? Okay, that's fine. That's not this criminal thing. It's just something that you enjoy as a person. That's something about you, So it sort of takes the stigma away from it. It teaches people, it kind of puts all drugs into perspective too, because before this, it was like tobacco and alcohol, and then there was drugs.
Yeah.
And now people realize like, oh, they're all drugs, so it's a more reasonable view about what these things are, and I think fundamentally not a lot is going to change because, like I said before when I was talking to you about this, people were already doing it anyway, even though it was illegal. So now they're just not having to hide it as much. So maybe it seems like there's all these new people smoking weed, but I feel like the majority of people who are smoking weed now would have smoked weed whether it was legal or not.
Absolutely not. I think that it's really not going to change much because it's already everywhere, and it'll just help with education, but also like health and things like that. And if it gets regulated, you're not going to get laced, content anymore.
That's a huge thing. In Colorado, so many roads. You'll drive down the road. It's a beautifully well-kept road, no potholes. You see a sign on the side there, sponsored by fill in the blank dispensary. So it's making a difference. It also, I think it goes to school funding, like the tax from buying weed. So like you can use the tax to benefit your community too.
And weren't you saying that in Iowa, the roads were just like horrible and full of potholes and everything like that?
Most Midwestern states are really bad.
Well, then they're going to fill them in, and they'll literally be called potholes.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay. Well, I think we can wrap it up about there. That's really all I really have to say about cannabis, unless you have anything to add.
No, that's all. That was really good.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Leo. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, fellow history lovers and cigar aficionados out there, keep on buffing and keep on puffing. See you at the next one.